Thank you, Jane, and welcome to everyone. This past December, Boston College scholars released a document entitled "To Serve the People of God, Renewing the Conversation on Priesthood and Ministry," which was published in Origins. The study was the fruits of a 2-year study on the renewal of the priesthood and ministry for a contemporary church. Together with Richard Ghilardi of the Theology Department, tonight's presenters, Thomas Groome and Richard Lennan, co-chaired this study, and Jacqueline Regan was a participant in the study along with 8 others. And some of those 8 others are in the audience. Perhaps we can just raise hands. I see Father Baldwin. Any other? Am I missing any other participants? So other participants, we have a whole crew. So I just want to give a shout out that this was the product of a great collaboration. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters in the order in which they will speak. Thomas Groome, born and raised in County Kildare, Ireland, holds a degree in divinity from St. Patrick's Seminary in Carlow, Ireland, and master's and doctoral degrees in religious education from Fordham University and Union Theological Seminary, Columbia University, respectively. He has been teaching at Boston College since 1976, which he will tell you is shortly after he made his first communion. I actually heard that Jesus assigned him, but that's... Tom is professor of theology and religious education in the School of Theology and Ministry and served as director of the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry and is chair of the STM Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry for many years. Last year, Tom completed an appointment as director of the Church in the 21st Century Center and initiated this study on the priesthood. Tom has several books to his credit, including Will There Be Faith? A New Vision for Educating and Growing Disciples, published by Harper One in 2011 and available for sale at the bookstore table in the back. Tom is renowned for having developed the shared Christian practices pedagogy, one that is rooted in experience and reflection, aligned with scripture and tradition, and designed for action. As the primary author of religion curricula for parishes and schools, Tom has had an impact on the faith formation of generations of Catholics. Our second presenter, Jacqueline Regan, is a native of Salem, Massachusetts. She holds a bachelor's degree in history and religious studies from the College of the Holy Cross. That's that other Jesuit school in Massachusetts. Jackie's professional career began in the corporate world before she discerned a vocation to educational ministry in the church. While working as a parish minister, Jackie earned a Master's of Divinity degree and an MA in Spiritual Direction from the Weston Jesuit School of Theology. For 4 years, she served as the Dean of Students at Weston Jesuit until her appointment in 2008 as Associate Dean of Student Affairs at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, a position she continues to hold. As part of a team of 4 associate deans, Jackie works in spiritual and human formation, oversees STM liturgy and community life, and assists our students and alumni with career placement. Jackie is the mother of 2 adult children, and in her free time enjoys running and singing, often at the same time. She is a member of St. Ignatius Parish, where she is involved in music ministry and serves as the director of the RCIA program. Thirdly, Richard Lennan, a priest of the Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle in Australia, holds a Master of Philosophy degree from the University of Oxford and a doctorate in theology from the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Richard is professor of systematic theology and professor ordinarius in the School of Theology and Ministry, where he also served as chair of the ecclesiastical faculty for 3 years. Prior to coming to Boston in 2007, for 15 years, Richard taught theology at the Catholic Institute of Sydney and had wide involvement in ecumenical activities and pastoral planning in Australia and New Zealand. He is also a past president of the Australian Theological Association. His principal fields of study are ecclesiology, ecumenism, and the theology of ministry, with a particular interest in the theology and spirituality of Karl Rahner. Richard serves on the editorial board of the journal Theological Studies and chairs the steering committee of the Karl Rahner Society. Richard is the author of 2 books and editor of 5 others, including 2 that feature contributions by STM faculty and are also offered for sale this evening in the back. Hope, Promise, Possibility, and Fulfillment, published by Paulus Press in 2013, and more recently, The Holy Spirit, Setting the World on Fire, published by Paulus in 2017. On weekends, Richard assists with the liturgy at Sacred Heart Parish in North Quincy, Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming Thomas Groome, Jackie Regan, and Richard Lennan, who will continue their work in opening a new conversation on the ordained priesthood.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you especially for mentioning my book being on sale at the back. Teddy always needs new shoes for the winter, and this winter has been unduly harsh. So if you want to contribute to Teddy's shoe fund, that the book is for sale. Thank you. My happy task is to introduce this wonderful document, to serve the people of God, renewing the conversation on priesthood and ministry. I'm going to summarize what we set out to do, why we set out to do it, and how we went about it. And then my beloved colleagues, Jackie and Richard, will elaborate and review the outcome of our work and then some of the implications. So what do we set out to do? In many ways, it can be stated very briefly. We wanted to articulate a contemporary theology of ministry in general, and then of the priesthood in particular. Not indeed as the final word on the subject, but rather to renew or perhaps catalyze a fresh conversation. Why do we think this was needed? Well, first, and to state the obvious, any fair-minded person would agree that there's a devastating scandal surrounding our Catholic priesthood and episcopacy at this time, caused by horrendous sexual crimes against children, youth, and dependents, and doing dreadful damage, first to victims and their families, and then to the whole church, and this increasingly being recognized now as worldwide. Just this morning, the Boston Globe has another headline and a major essay on the depressing figures that almost another 1/3 of Catholics are considering leaving our beloved church. Prompted largely by this scandal, the figures are already estimate that something like 35 million people in the United States now identify themselves as former Catholics, and now another 1/3 threatening to leave us, and primarily around this scandal. I always think that I'm so sad to see people leave our church, but my greatest fear when they leave our church is they also may lose their faith, and I think that would be the ultimate tragedy. But even before the current round of scandals, the Pennsylvania report, the McCarrick stories, the church in the 21st century here at Boston College recognized the need for a new understanding and practice of priesthood, and that the C21 Center could indeed make a significant contribution in sponsoring such a study, especially it being totally in keeping with the purpose of that fine C21 Center to be a source of reform and renewal for the Catholic Church. So here I want to recognize, before we go any further, and express great appreciation for the sponsorship of C21 and its generous administrative and financial support of the project. Though the document is now owned, quote unquote, by the School of Theology and Ministry and the Boston College Theology Department, C21 deserves great credit as it being its original sponsor and helped to finance it. I want to particularly recognize Karen Kiefer, who at the time was my associate director, but in fact was the one in charge of the purse strings and made the money readily available. She's now the director of the C21 Center and also a signature of the document. She participated actively for 2 years in the seminar itself. So I would like to invite Karen, wherever she is, to stand and take a well-deserved bow. Karen, I think she's still here. Here she is. Unlike her predecessor in that role, she's quite humble and quite different. But C21 provided the money, to be crass about it, to bring in leading scholars for the breakfasts that we had, even provided a small stipend for the seminar members to make them feel guilty if they didn't come, and it was very effective. I've been a part of faculty seminars that started off wonderfully in September and did well in October, but by November things were getting busy. By December they were into finals and nobody or only 2 people showed. So we had a wonderful attendance throughout the 2 years, and it was large. Well, it wasn't because of the small stipend we paid, but I think it may have helped. Since the beginning of his pontificate, and apart altogether from the clergy sex abuse scandal and problem, Pope Francis has been decrying what he calls the curse of clericalism. Pretty strong language. A clericalism that exalts and pedestalizes priests with power over people's lives, whereas in fact they should be located as servant leaders within the community of all the baptized, empowering us to be co-responsible for the church's mission as a field hospital that helps to heal the wounds of the world. Instead of reciting rules and regulations as if from on high, Pope Francis urges priests to encourage people in their own discernment of how best to live out the gospel, and often repeating that the gospel's ultimate name is mercy. Now, this clericalism that pedestalizes priests and that Pope Francis so often laments has a historical and, more importantly, a theological background. And while it may be stepping back a bit from the church's immediate problems, like the sex abuse scandal, yet we're convinced that this clericalist theology of priesthood desperately needs, to be recast and reformulated, and that, hopefully with God's help, will be part of the solution of our present crisis. At least some of the sources of the clericalism can be found, I believe, in the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent, especially in the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, the Council of Trent, as you know, was that great Catholic Council of Reform in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. But the decrees of Trent weren't even translated into English for about 260 years. So the document that really implemented the Council of Trent was the Catechism of Trent, which my students are reading in their class for this coming Tuesday, or at least reading a part of it. And because the Catechism became the text that priests preached on a 3-year cycle, repeating the Catechism over and over, year after year. And this is what they were to preach. Now, when it came to the Sacrament of Holy Orders, I just want to read the sacrament. This is as often called the Roman Catechism, or the Catechism of the Council of Trent. I just want to read it on Holy Orders. It says, "The first thing for the faithful to be instructed in is the dignity and greatness of this sacrament, especially in its highest degree, which is the priesthood. Priests and bishops are, as it were, the interpreters and messengers of God, commissioned in his name to teach men the divine law. They act in this world as the very person of God. It is evident that no office greater than theirs can possibly be imagined. Rightly have they been called angels and even gods." Now, it's a small g, but nonetheless. "Holding as they do among us the very name and the power of the living God." Now, that's why Miss Garrity in 2nd grade told us that if we're passing through the village and we meet Father Murphy and our guardian angel, that we should salute Father Murphy first, because he's closer to God than our guardian angel. Now, that type of clericalism, that adulation, pedestalizing, exaggeration, it's understandable in the historical context of the time. The more the reformers emphasized the priesthood of all believers, the more the Catholic Church downplayed the priesthood of all believers and upplayed the ordained priesthood. How? So that's why we thought there was need for a contemporary theology of priesthood, of ministry and priesthood. How do we go about it? We assembled a scholarly seminar for study and research, intent to draw upon the best of the broader tradition of priesthood before Trent, going back into those early centuries of the church, which indeed Vatican II began to do. But then, as our colleague Richard Gillardi, and a co-chair of the seminar, Rick often says, Vatican II left priesthood as unfinished business. It began the work, and I'll say more about that in a moment, and my colleagues will elaborate, but left it unfinished. We assembled 12 working members, 6 notable theologians, with the exception of myself, but all with relative expertise on the particular topic. We had 2 Boston College officers of the university who work in spiritual formation, Jackie being one of them, Kieran the other. 2 PhD students, one in theology, one in theology and education. 2 priests from the Archdiocese of Boston, one the dean of our local deanery, and then a master student from the STM as our scribe. 5 women and 7 men in all. And the names of the signatures are on the back, but let me just, Tom had started to do this, let me just recognize the ones who I think are here. John Baldwin. John, would you maybe stand? I know you waved the last time, but maybe you give a stand. John. Liam Berrigan is not with us. Boyd Taylor Coleman, Jim Flavin, Rich Gillardi, I don't think he's here, myself. Megan Hopkins is here. Oh, Rick is here, please. Now, Rick, could you stand, please? Oh, don't wave, just stand. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Richard. Rick Gillardi. Megan Hopkins. Megan is here, I know. Megan, thank you, Megan. Emily Jesnick. Is Emily here? Yes, Emily. Thank you, Emily. Karen, I said already, Richard is beside me here. Elise Raby. Elise, the theology doctoral student. Elise, here's Elise. And then Jackie. Thank you to all of them. We began in September of 2016. We met 4 times each semester for 2 years. And then we had a final meeting this past May. So we had 17 formal gatherings in all. And even thereafter, we had many revisions. The revisions continued through the summer and on even as late as November. We read widely theological texts and essays, and then all of the relevant church documents regarding priesthood. I won't, in the interest of time, won't list them all, but for example, Pastoris Dabo Vobis, the great major statement by Pope John Paul II, the program of priestly formation, the co-workers in the vineyard, and disciples in mission, the pastoral plan of the Archdiocese of Boston. We read widely. We realized early on that we would need to limit ourselves to diocesan priesthood and to the American context in particular. Now, we hope that what we say has relevance universally in the life of the church, and indeed for order priests as well. Indeed, there's an essay coming in America soon which picks up the conversation and finds great resonance. And yet, we thought it wisest to limit ourselves to diocesan priesthood in the American context. Methodologically, we chose the approach of practical theology. This means to begin with the present state of the question and then to theologize from that data with an eye to making recommendations for renewed pastoral praxis. So our first task was to study the present state of priesthood and of seminary education in the United States. And to this end, we brought in leading experts like Mary Gauthier, research associate at CARA. Her book, Priestly Ministry in the 21st Century, is a definitive work. We brought in Professor Katharina Schutt from the University of St. Thomas, who is probably the best expert on the present state of seminary education in the United States. Father Eamon Conway from the University of Limerick. His collection of essays entitled Priesthood Today is considered to be the most recent best scholarship on priesthood. Professor David Hunter, the chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Kentucky, world-renowned expert in the early church history, especially its forms and functions of ministry. And by the way, David is about to join our faculty here at the Theology Department beginning next September. Father Walter Woods, a former professor at St. John's Seminary, who at that time was much-loved pastor of a parish collaborative out in Acton, Massachusetts. Walter has since retired, to talk about his experience of clustering parishes and the whole experiment of international priests to help meet the clergy shortage and so on. So lots of people, both from the academic world and from the trenches of the church's life, who could indeed well inform us on the present state of affairs. We spent 3 semesters in a concerted research and deep conversation, and then all of spring 2018, we focused on writing and editing the drafts. And again, I want to recognize John Baldwin and Jackie, Regan, and Richard Lennan were our writing committee. But as you know, I think Jackie and John unanimously decided that Richard should be the primary scribe. And as you know, no committee ever writes a document. It's always some person puts their rear on the chair and writes a document. And then it got severely edited, as I think they remember well. We went through 6-7 drafts before we finally went public with it. Very early on, we realized that we couldn't take on everything in a brief, readable document. We needed precise focus. In addition to this, our group spanned the ideological spectrum, from people who would favor opening priesthood to women and to our married people, to members who would favor continuing with celibate males. As our study and conversation unfolded, we discerned that the best service we could render and the conversation we might effectively encourage would be to step back from the controversies surrounding admission to ordination and to ask the more fundamental question: what does it mean to be ordained in the first place? What is the nature, the purpose of priesthood? What are its necessary charisms? How should we prepare people for it? How would we encourage the ongoing education and formation of our priests? To quote the document itself, we said, irrespective of who is to be ordained, the church must be clear in its understanding and expectation of priestly ministry. We picked up those seeds from Vatican II, especially its relocating of ordained ministry within the priesthood of all the baptized, and also its reclaiming of the broader functions of priestly ministry beyond presiding to pastoring and preaching as well. Let me just, I say retrieving, I'm conscious of times here, I say retrieving Vatican II's theology of priesthood because in many ways that the incipient seeds that were sown or retrieved at Vatican II were set aside. And I can say more about that in the conversation. But in the aftermath of the council, it was set aside for a variety of reasons, especially with Pope Benedict XVI, it seemed, where the church began to re-emphasize the purely cultic function, the sacred power of the priest, and neglecting those broader functions of preaching and pastoring as well. Let me skip over the rest of this and go straight to the conclusion and then hand over to Jackie, or to my conclusion. Jackie and Richard will do the conclusion. Having completed the final edits last November and having cleared permissions with Father Leahy as our president, Dean Stegman, because it was going to be mentored by or sponsored by the School of Theology and Ministry as well as the Theology Department, having cleared all of the bases, etc., we said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get Origins to publish it? Origins, as you know, is a publishing arm of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So I called Edmund Brosnan, the editor there. His people are all from Kerry, and that helped a little, I think. And I asked him, would he be interested in publishing the document? He said, well, send it to me. He called me 2 days later. He said, Tom, we're going to publish it. And I said, oh, my goodness, that's marvelous. When? Fully expect him to say next May. And he said, next week. And indeed, they published it the following week. It has gone out now to over 600 bishops. It has gone to Pope Francis. We're assured that he is pleased with it, that he has read in it, or has had at least somebody read it for him, I suppose, more likely. We were recently assured that it will most likely become a key resource for the upcoming Synod of Bishops, the Pan-Amazon Synod next October, that it will certainly influence the Instrumentum Laboris, the opening document of that council. We're thrilled, of course. It's helpful to have friends in high places, and our beloved colleague Raphael Luciani has delivered a lot of this personally for us. It also has been translated into Spanish. We're now beginning to disperse the Spanish translation, thanks to Hosman Espino. So just to wind down, we say at the end of To Serve the People of God that we can certainly expect, quote, further changes regarding priesthood as the future unfolds. We also include, in concluding, we cite Elizabeth Johnson, who says there can be no future of priesthood in the church that women do not have a pivotal hand in shaping, end of quote. So there's lots of more to come, shall we say. Meanwhile, we're hopeful that To Serve the People of God offers a contemporary theology that priesthood that can foster a new conversation regarding the future of ministry and of priesthood in our beloved church. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Our decision to focus on a contemporary theology of priesthood and the formation of ordained ministers emerged from our own work at Boston College, at the School of Theology and Ministry, and the Archdiocese of Boston. This is what we know and do. And as mentioned, the process and composition of the group itself, lay women and men, diocesan and Jesuit priests, theologians and pastoral ministers, embodied in a very powerful way the model of collaboration and the way of proceeding that we promote at BC and at the STM, and that we propose for other programs of formation. Indeed, we hope this becomes an even more common way of proceeding for our church. We realize, as Tom mentioned, that many people might be disappointed that this new conversation on ordained priesthood doesn't take up the issue of the ordination of women and married men. I am no stranger to this disappointment. I want to add, as one of the 5 women in the group, that in each of our conversations over the 2-year period, the voices of women, the reality of the growing number of Catholics who have either disengaged or count themselves among the dones, and the sentiments of those who are losing any real hope that change will come, were very much with us as we discerned what we could offer the church on contemporary priesthood. In my presentation, I will focus on parts 1 and 2 of our paper, the theological underpinnings of ministry in the life of the church, and the profile of a well-formed priest. The first part of the text, to serve the people of God, provides the theological context for ministry, locating all of the church's ministries as a reflection of God's life with us as Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity, far from some abstract principle, provides a relational framework for the life of faith and in a particular way for the lives of ministers and priests. Ministry is profoundly relational because it is rooted in the triune love and grace of God, who has reached into human history to be one with us. This is a God who redeems us in Jesus Christ and who continues to draw us into deeper communion with God's own self and with one another through the ongoing and ever-present activity of the Holy Spirit. This Trinitarian starting point for ministry, rather than an historical or institutional starting point, lends sharper focus to the way in which we, as God's pilgrim people, as baptized disciples of Jesus Christ, discern, respond to, and embody the life-giving Spirit of God. Our Catholic faith provides a rich spiritual, social justice, intellectual, and liturgical tradition which supports discernment of our place in the world. For many of us, this discernment takes shape, and is given meaning through engagement with the one mission of the church. Through baptism, we are all conformed to Christ and called to participate in the life and communion of the church and its ministries, to live and proclaim the gospel, to serve those most in need, to engage with, not withdraw from, the cultures and communities of which we are a part. And in all of this, to be a sacrament, an instrument of God's love in and for the world. It is from baptism and discipleship that we begin to look at ministry. Although all people are called to be, by baptism, to be disciples, to be Christ's body in the world through the Spirit-filled mission of the church, not all men and women are called to be or want to be ministers who provide leadership for enacting the mission. And this ministry, which is broader than ordained ministry and narrower than discipleship, is always for service. We state that ministers are disciples first and remain disciples even as they engage in ministry. This is an important point for both lay and ordained ministers in the church. Clerical culture develops when any subset of ministers view themselves or assent to others' perception of themselves as spiritual elites and somehow special to God. What is unique to ministers is the relationship to the church. Ministry repositions a person for service in realizing the church's ministry, and all ministers are called to deeper and continual conversion as part of their own discipleship. Sister Veronica Openibo, an STM alumna who spoke at the Synod of Bishops last month in Rome, addressed the Pope and bishops in these words: "It worries me when I see in Rome and elsewhere the youngest seminarians being treated as though they are more special than everyone else, thus encouraging them to assume, from the beginning of their training, exalted ideas about their status. Although Sister Veronica made a statement about candidates for ordination, the same admonition applies to all ministers and all people preparing for ministry in the church. Having laid the foundation of the theology of the Trinity and its relationship to ministry as it applies to all the baptized, now let's turn to what's particular to priesthood. We'll continue to use the relational model that we just outlined so that we're not talking only about functions and what priests can do in isolation from the community of faith. In fact, from the outset, a priority of the seminar was to develop greater clarity around the relationship between the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of the baptized. The first point is that the ordination to ministerial priesthood emerges from and builds on the sacraments of initiation. It isn't a ritual that magically and mechanically turns a priest into something he is not and sets him above other Catholics. It builds on the special relationship and the special character of baptism and confirmation, and also on the humanity, faith, and capacity for service that seminary formation seeks to cultivate and enhance. Sister Katarina Schuth writes in her 2016 book, Seminary Formation, that leaders are not born of ordination. So the charisms, human qualities, and perhaps above all, capacity for relationships should be manifest in priest candidates before they are ordained. Ordination can no longer be regarded as the conferral of ecclesial power that lacks accountability and is marked by insularity. Through ordination and the grace of Spirit, the church appoints priests for service to the people of God. As stated in our document, the sacrament of orders conforms and reconfigures the priest's relationship to Christ, to the church, and to all of the baptized, so that he acts in the person of Christ, the head. And as the Leadership Roundtable stated clearly in a report published last month in response to the twin crises of abuse and leadership failures in the church, this leadership must be transparent, accountable, competent, just, and co-responsible with the laity, so that it models the clergy and lay collaboration that is the future of our church. From the documents of Vatican II and from the work of our colleague, Father John Baldovin, we identified 5 central aspects of priestly ministry, which are foundations of their ministry in relationship to God and the community of faith. These are the priest as preacher, as leader of worship and prayer, as collaborative leader, public representative, and practitioner of pastoral charity. First, the priest as preacher. Although a 2018 Pew survey on why Americans go to religious services reports that Catholics are significantly less likely than other churchgoers, Christian churchgoers, to say that the sermons are what keeps them coming back, 71% to 36%. Preaching the gospel is at the heart of priestly ministry. Most of us would be able to identify people who have left a parish or the church itself because of poor preaching. Anyone ordained to presbyteral ministry must have the capacity and communication skills to preach the gospel with faith, courage, creativity, knowledge of the scriptures and theology, engagement with people, and the complexities of the world. As stated in a March 6 U.S. Catholic article on best practices of worship, quote, homilies must connect with people in the pews. They have to be relevant to people's real-time circumstances, even as they may deeply challenge them and mess with the status quo. For many people, this is the one and only Christ-inspired message people hear all week, close quote. Second, Priest as leader of worship and prayer. The Pew study also mentioned that the primary reason people across all faith traditions attend religious services is their desire to grow closer to God. This highlights the need for priests to be confident as leaders of prayer and worship at the Eucharist and in other sacramental liturgies. Last August, I appreciated the way the parish priest of St. Ignatius here in Chestnut Hill served as both people and leaders of prayer at Sunday Eucharist, when new and egregious disclosures appeared in the press detailing the extent of the sexual abuse crisis and the failure of bishops to respond. As horrible as the news was, and confounding the cynicism of our wider society, Catholics continued to go to church in large numbers. We needed leaders of prayer who could name the sadness and anger without getting stuck in it, presiders who could lift the assembly in prayer to our merciful God. Third, the priest is collaborative leader. When Sister Katerina Schuth visited with us in November of 2016, as Tom mentioned, we were beginning our work together, and she presented highlights from her research on her recently published book, Seminary Formation. Sister Katerina reported that while there has been a significant reduction in the pedestalizing of priests because of the sex abuse crisis, priests ordained in the first decade of the 21st century have moved away from the servant leader model of priesthood that was common among priests in the post-Vatican II era. Priests who inspired and empowered many of us to serve in the church. She also reported that younger priests tend to resist managerial responsibilities, which they don't see as a function of spiritual leadership, nor as an opportunity to draw out the gifts and talents of members of their communities. As a result, relationship with veteran pastoral ministers, most of whom are women, are often marked by tension. Finally, Sister Katerina spoke to a reality we know well at the STM. For many years in the aftermath of Vatican II, most seminaries had lay and ordination track students studying together as a way of preparing both groups for collaboration in the ministries of the church. This is the model we remain committed to at the STM. However, there are very few seminaries and religious order houses of formation that still follow this model, in large part as a result of the Episcopal visitation of seminaries, which started in 2005 and ended in 2008. These trends are particularly troubling in view of the importance of collaboration for effective ministry in the church on every level, from synods of bishops to diocesan and university boards to parish councils. Parishes and parish clusters are increasingly complex, multicultural organizations that depend upon a variety of ministers to serve the needs of the community. Collaboration and lay ecclesial ministry, more than just a stopgap for the priest shortage, better reflects the Trinitarian model, the Trinitarian framework of relationship within which we locate the renewal of the priesthood. Therefore, on both a spiritual and practical level, priests are not meant to be lone rangers, and lay ministers are not meant to be Santa's little helpers. In order to foster communion, priests need to not only act collaboratively, but to think collaboratively, to know what their role is and what it isn't. This involves more than delegation. It's a matter of identifying the gifts of the community and calling upon members of the parish staff or parishioners to lead in areas where they can. According to a 2015 report from the Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolate, better known as CARA, there are 37,000 priests in the US and 39,000 lay ecclesial ministers working in parishes. 80% of these ecclesial ministers are women. This does not include the number of lay women who are teachers and theologians, high school and college campus ministers, and hospital chaplains. In light of this reality, we want to underscore the importance of mutuality in ministerial relationships, and that a well-formed priest must be able to work well and equitably with women. This cannot happen when mutual respect and learning is lacking, when women aren't looked at or spoken to, when they're not acknowledged, heard, or appreciated, when their intelligence and opinions aren't taken seriously, when they're not included at every level of decision-making, when they're not present in the sanctuary, mentioned in homilies, or viewed as partners in ministry. Women, like priests, should not be pedestalized for any type of particular genius, but should be valued rather than viewed as a threat for all that they offer the church. Fourth, the priest as public representative. The priest must be able to represent the church to the people of God and also to the wider public. Where do we see priests representing the church publicly? Do we see them among those most in need, with the weak of the world, to quote 1 Corinthians, or only with those whose lives are secure? Fifth, and finally, priest is practitioner of pastoral charity. Do the demands of priesthood and current structures prevent the priest from witnessing to the joy of the gospel, from being available to people, let alone find time for prayer, retreats, and ongoing formation? This portrait of the priest is not something new. What we present in this essay is rooted in the documents of Vatican II and has developed in church teaching since then. But it needs to be translated into action. A step towards this is the way in which priests are educated and formed for ordination. And so now I'll turn it over to Richard, who will summarize part 3 of the document that speaks specifically to programs of formation.
Well done.
At the very beginning of our text, we have a quote from Pope Francis. It's this: "The church and the world need mature and well-balanced priests, fearless and generous pastors, capable of closeness, listening, and mercy." The question, of course, is, where do we get such priests? We might wait for them to drop from the sky or hope they turn up on the next bus. But more likely, if we are to have those priests, we will have them because of the way that they're formed. And it's formation on which I would like to concentrate in my part of the presentation. And formation is really the final section of our text. It's important to understand that even the word formation is a recent word. It's more a post-Vatican II word than even a Vatican II word. Prior to our use of this word, the only way to describe preparation for priesthood was training. And the implication of the word training was that it was a set of skills that was being imprinted on a blank page. The goal of seminary formation, seminary training, certainly always was to produce holy priests. But that outcome was associated most with discipline and with certain styles of education. What Vatican II does for the first time in the Church's history is to produce a document on the preparation for priesthood. Prior to that, the dominant model of seminary formation had still been that which emerged from the Council of Trent. And if you look at Trent on seminaries, it says quite explicitly that the goal is to take young men before they've had a chance to be corrupted by the world, and then to form them in the style of priest that Trent has in mind. And that was often facilitated, of course, by building seminaries in remote locations so that they could be cut off from all sorts of corrupting influences. It's interesting to reflect that until the document on formation that Tom referenced, Pastores Dabo Vobis, which came out of the Synod of Formation in 1990, was published by John Paul II in 1992, there'd been no mention in documents about preparation for priesthood of the human person. The human person prior to Pastores Dabo Vobis was a subset of spiritual formation. That was true even for Vatican II. What you have in Pastores Dabo Vobis and what has become the norm for all styles of formation, both for ordained ministry but also for lay ecclesial ministry, is what's usually referred to as the 4 pillars of formation: human, spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral. In other words, the minister you want to form has to be able to combine those 4 qualities. There has to be a human being. That may sound like a statement of the obvious, and yet it's that most important thing that's often been neglected. Often our history of formation has been that the emphasis has been on eliminating the human and replacing the human with the priest. The priest we want has to be a human being. And so Pastores Dabo Vobis says unequivocally that human formation is the foundation of all formation. In our text, we identify 5 areas of formation. And what I'd like to do for my presentation is simply go through what we say about each of those 5 areas. First one is about vocation, namely, who's the product, who's the raw material, if you like, for the process of formation. In times of declining numbers, the concern can be simply to get as many as possible. It's interesting, Pope Pius XII wrote a document on priesthood decrying the decline in numbers and worrying about how desperate the numbers had become in 1935. Pius XII echoed that same principle in 1950, and then Vatican II takes it up, quoting Pius XI's message from 1935. Probably for most of us, looking back at what the situation looked like in 1935, it was, as Monty Python would say, luxury. The danger when the focus is on the decline in numbers is that the more you get, the better it is. So let me quote Pope Francis talking about that and addressing bishops, particularly those who are not careful about who they admit to seminaries. So this is Francis. Please, and it's printed with a few exclamation marks. We must consider the good of the people of God. Francis goes on to talk about, and we elaborate on in our text, that the stress has to be on a capacity for self-giving. And that's also how Vatican II describes it in Optatum Totius, the document on formation. That this capacity for self-giving is the basis for priestly holiness, and that it's not a choice between a commitment to prayer and a commitment to service. So Francis speaks of the fact that there's no disembodied perfection. In other words, it's the human being who's going to be the holy priest. And that means, as Jackie emphasised, a capacity for relationship with women and men. Underpinning that is the fundamental Christian insight, that grace is incarnational. Karl Rahner says that God operates with an incarnational logic. God doesn't operate with disembodied people. Francis speaks of the defining feature of the saints as a capacity to be happy and hopeful. Often we've associated holiness with being as separated from life as possible. I think Francis is putting the opposite emphasis. And that then has implications for who is admitted to seminaries. What's the raw material? Second point about formation has to do with the seminary itself. That there needs to be a balance between an openness to growth, in other words, a recognition that entry into the seminary isn't the same thing as being ready for ordination. A balance between that openness and the fact that those who enter seminaries are not tabula rasa. In other words, that they're not blank sheets on which everything needs to be written. So the challenge for seminaries is how do you stimulate that openness to growth, be it in education, theological studies, in personal development, in pastoral formation, but also encourage students in the use of the gifts that they have. And getting those two things in balance for good of serving the people of God is the task of seminary education. Pastores Dabo Vobis in article number 77 says that effective ministry is connected to personal maturity, and that the personality of the priest is to be a bridge, not an obstacle, for people to meet Christ. It's really the same principle about the human being the raw material of formation. And that means that one of the priorities of formation has to be to addressing issues of sexuality. As sexuality is part of how we relate to one another. We know that the crisis the church has lived through for the last few decades has been about sexuality. And so it makes more urgent finding ways to address that are healthy, that are aligned to being fully human and to understanding holiness as also being fully human. One of the things we emphasise in our text is the need for both men and women to work in formation. Formation has usually been the province of priests forming people to be priests. But if priests are to serve the church, then their formation is best done when it echoes what the church actually looks like. And the church is a combination of men and women. So to have men and women serving in formation increases the chances that the priest who emerges as the product of that formation process is more fully human, as well as having a deeper capacity for service and holiness. One other topic that aligns with that, it echoes something that Jackie also mentioned, is that it's who teaches people who are preparing for priesthood and who do they study with. Seminaries traditionally have been about candidates for priesthood, full stop. And while at different times since the council we've moved more in the direction of candidates for priesthood studying with other people, pursuing theology and also pursuing ministerial life, the pendulum in the last 25 years has swung back in the opposite direction, so that lay formational programs and priestly formational programs have become totally separate and divided entities. So a challenge is, how do we overcome that division? The third category of formation that we address is the issue of ongoing formation. This is something that emerges both out of Optatum Totius and then even more strongly out of Pastores Dabo Vobis. In multiple spheres of life today, we've become accustomed to talk about lifelong learning. That graduation is not the end of learning, it's the beginning of a different phase of learning. Traditionally, seminaries were about ending of learning, about filling the tank and sending you out with that full tank. one of the texts we read in preparation or as part of our study spoke of an intergenerational reluctance of priests to undertake ongoing formation. And some of that is ascribable to reaction against seminary training and what that has looked like. But to be a pastoral associate in the Archdiocese of Boston, you actually have to be committed to ongoing forms of formation. That is not something that's required of priests. And in most places, any form of supervision has yet to become the norm. Part of the challenge of ongoing formation is for bishops, priests, and for the whole community of faith to support it. Part of that, as I said, the resistance to it is the legacy of seminary training. It's also about contemporary busyness and the fact that ongoing formation will make priests less available at certain times, and that means there has to be a generous response from the whole community of faith to support that. So if priests are regarded as workhorses who are supposed to be there all the time, there's not going to be an environment that encourages them to undertake ongoing formation. Point number 4 is about collaboration. Collaboration is more than a necessity for the contemporary ministerial environment. It's a way to reflect the church. If we are a community of the baptized, if we are a community of priests who are ordained and the priesthood of the baptized, then priests of all of those shades working together is necessary for the full realization of the life of the church. Collaboration is challenging. It brings us into contact with the only people we can work with, namely people who are not me. And that means they have different attitudes, different approaches, and often that brings us into conflict. So learning how to deal with conflict, learning how to not make my priorities the only priorities is all part of collaboration. And again, it reinforces the importance of human formation. Collaboration also involves learning to live with cultural diversity, which is becoming more and more a feature of the life of our church. The 5th point, the final one, is about openness to the future. Priesthood has a history because it hasn't always been the same. And the expectation then is that its future will also involve difference. Difference that none of us can foresee or predict with any certainty. And that means that what becomes most important is discernment. What are appropriate changes in the life of priesthood? What are appropriate forms of formation for the needs of our present? We quote Pope Francis towards the end of our document of the need to recognise and to overcome the challenge of complacency. And complacency means trying to get by the way we've always done things, trying to do business as usual long after the usual has become impossible. And that finally then reinforces the quality that we name towards the end of our document, and that's hope. Hope is what allows you to keep dealing with the challenges that you face, knowing that you're grounded in something bigger than your own capacities. Hope allows us to accept the good enough priest rather than the expectation of the perfect priest. At the end of the document, or just towards the end, we quote this section from Benedict XVI Spe Salvi, his document on hope. Only the great certitude of hope that my own life and history in general, despite all failures, are held firm by the indestructible power of love and that this gives them their meaning and importance, only this kind of hope can then give us the courage to act and persevere. Our text is a text of hope. It's grounded in the action of God in our world. It's grounded in the ongoing life of the Spirit in our church. And it's grounded in recognition of the need to face questions that must be faced if we are to be people of faith, of hope, and of love. Thank you.
I have one question. As I read and as you presented the 5 aspects of ministry, one thing an emphasis that I didn't see there was mission to the broader community, to the world in general, and social justice in particular.
Yes.
So that I found somewhat of a lack, and I'm wondering if you even thought of integrating the concept of missio Dei into those things to make that more real.
Right. I think in the way I outlined the 5 aspects of priestly ministry, those were the facets that really define and are part of priestly ministry. The missio Dei and the participation in the mission of the church belongs to all of us. And so it's the body of the church, the body of Christ, that is acting and enacting the mission to be Christ in the world and to serve the promotion of justice.
I think you're right. I mean, that we didn't deal with that. Part of the reason why was that we chose to focus on those things that traditionally have been the points of, either the points of emphasis about priesthood, so we've been trying to broaden those. One way that if we ever write a longer text than this would be to link it to preaching, that preaching is meant to be not just about spiritual growth, but how you live your life in the world, so that those 2 things are absolutely connected. That each of our 5 aspects can extend into how the priest serves the mission of the church in the world and how it's actually embodied in the priest's own life. So that is a lacuna in the present state of our text, but as I said, I think it's something that if you're going to write a larger thing about priesthood, then absolutely you need to do this.
Yeah, and I agree with the critique as well, that we use the language of pastoral charity, which is the language of Vatican II, but it's hardly enough. We should have, I think, used, and will, whatever the next step might be, use the language of justice, compassion, and outreach into the world. But I think we implied it, or we intended it at least, with the Vatican II language of pastoral charity.
You had a question?
Mine has to do with the 5 aspects.
Oh, sorry?
Maybe let the woman. Maybe we have a woman ask a question now.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's okay. We'll be right back.
Mine also has to do with the 5 aspects. I think it was St. Francis who said that one should preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. And when I saw your 5 aspects, I was rather disappointed to see that preaching was primary, and all the way down 5, and the last one was pastoral charity. And I was wondering if that was an unbalanced priority.
Well, I can take that one. It reflects the emphasis of Vatican II. So Vatican II, those in my class this morning, I apologize, you're going to hear this again. Vatican II describes preaching as the primum officium, the first task of the priest. Now, to understand that, you have to understand it against its background, which is the neglect of preaching, and you also have to understand it against Vatican II's retrieval of the life of Scripture for the Christian community, which had been underplayed significantly for Catholics. So there's a historical context for thinking about the importance of preaching. It's also, though, important to emphasise that preaching is connected to all of those other aspects. So to see those 5 aspects as integrated rather than simply 5 things that you get to choose from. That effective preaching ultimately leads to pastoral charity, just as seeking to live a life of pastoral charity brings you back to the need to be nurtured by the Word of God within the worshipping community and so on. So, and your own life of prayer. So it's not that because one is 5, it's 4 times less important. It's actually starting with a model that puts the Word of God at the heart of the Christian community, and everything else radiates out from that.
If I could just make a quick comment to follow on from that, I think one of my favorite parts of the document is toward the end, when we cull out the 5 characteristics, the 5 charisms that we think are required or sine qua non for the vocation of priesthood. And just very briefly, a capacity to preach well, an ability to prayerfully lead the Christian community in its shared worship of God, the presiding charism, the gift of collaborative leadership, the commitment to an exemplary life, the 4th one, and then a commitment to pastoral charity, which would include compassion and justice. And I think the benefit for me coming out of the document is that after all of our reading and conversation and back and forth and editing and all the rest of it, we basically came down to those 5 charisms. That's what people need if they want to aspire to priesthood, and they don't need it. There's no other requirements that have theological warrant at this point in time, other than those 5 charisms. So if somebody has those charisms, then to me at least, they're qualified to aspire to priesthood.
Thank you, and I thought we thought it was a great presentation. The content, the format, the things you emphasized. With I guess the parenthetical comment that we would like to see the case for women being ordained and becoming priests, for not to keep kicking the can down the road, I guess. But that's probably a long way off. Having said that, and I was just thinking of those 5 charisms, you call them, it seems to me to be able to do those things, again, how many human beings are capable of doing them at a high enough level? And one of the most encouraging things that you spoke about that I think is a huge, not just mind shift, but kind of heart shift and soul shift, is you use the word servant leader, and a couple times you use the word collaborative leader. To be that kind of person requires such an enormous shift from the current hierarchical model of specialness of clericalism. I think that's at the heart of the issue. And I can remember speaking to a priest who worked for the Archbishop O'Malley. This was about 10 years ago, and he was got his PhD in organizational development and human development. It just seems that the big question is, how do you get from where we are today to that place? And in the seminaries and in the archdiocese, to get the mind and heart shift to realize how much of a stretch this is going to be, how different this is going to be, to have priests who truly understand and believe what it means to be a servant leader and a collaborative leader. How can that happen?
You go.
Well, I think it's as we're saying, it should be part of formation, part of their ongoing learning. The Leadership Roundtable that I referenced has a very detailed plan and suggestions for how priests can become more collaborative, more in line with the servant leader model, which is, I think, a model that is really encouraged in schools of business management, that most of what is considered best practices in business management now in the corporate world is what we would consider servant leadership, which was, which I think the church was really providing some leadership in the early years after Vatican II, in terms of really taking the lead in forming people in that. So I think it is possible. I think priests can be formed. I think they can learn, but it is going to take a very intentional effort.
It's also recognizing that conversion for all of us, and this is it's important to keep coming back to this, for all of us is an ongoing reality, is an ongoing need. That's why we have Lent in the end. And that our expectation of perfection is so damaging. It's like when religious orders are electing new leaders and say, who do you want? And the answer is Jesus on one of his better days. But Jesus must have had the bad day as well. So it's how do we learn to provide an environment that encourages patience with each other, while we all recognize that we all need to be converted in an ongoing way. Because otherwise, the expectation just becomes cruel that the priest is somehow meant to be perfect.
One of this practical, in response to your comment, one of the practical suggestions we make, and Jackie used this in her introduction, is even the model that we're trying to follow, that we are following here at Boston College, where you've got lay people and seminarians, 100 or so seminarians, about 300 or whatever, lay people studying for ecclesial ministry, all in the same classroom together. I had an experience about 2 or 3 years ago now of a grandmother, it was one of my classes, who bonded with a young Jesuit scholastic. And when I would put them into groups of 2 to chat with their neighbor, these two would always get together. I would say that grandmother had more influence on his formation for priesthood because she had grandchildren, and some of whom go to church, some of whom don't, some of whom are married, some of whom are living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, some of whom are straight, some of whom are gay, and she loves them all. And she prepared that young man in many ways for priesthood in a way that I think was probably most significant to his life. The model of having lay people and seminarians studying together is it's a no-brainer, especially in a location like this. And even where in situations where there isn't a great school of theology or department of theology nearby, I think admitting lay people to our seminaries and insisting on lay faculty, men, women, lay people as faculty in our seminaries is simply imperative at this point in time. But again, Jackie mentioned it in that visitation of 2000 that began in 2005, in many ways set us back because the seminaries were beginning to hire women and beginning to hire lay people in their faculty, and they were all banned and barred after that visitation. So in a sense, we have to reclaim that impetus and especially look to how we're doing seminary education in the context of it, or else our future will be just the same as our past.
I actually have a question that follows that aspect on seminary formation, which is, according to the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the United States, seminary philosophy and theology training is structured exclusively around promoting the thought of one thinker, St. Thomas Aquinas. This has been the case by and large since the 1890s. How do you perceive this approach to diocesan seminary instruction changing in accordance with the desires of the document?
Well, if you look at Vatican II, when it talks about formation, it certainly mentions Thomas, but by no means in the same way that Thomas had been used in the centuries before that. So Thomistic philosophy is part of our heritage. We live in a far more pluralistic theological and philosophical environment. So to not be aware of that and to not take that into account in our formation would actually separate students for priesthood from the world and the church that they're actually part of. So it's not Thomas or no Thomas, it's Thomas in relationship to this whole extraordinary variety that is characteristic of our time. And that, too, is where discernment is so necessary. How do we use This is Vatican II recovering the bigger tradition. How do we use the whole richness of Christian heritage and not simply one aspect of it?
I would like to underscore.
Yeah.
I would like to underscore what was said both in the talk and in this article, that seminary formation take place within the university setting. And I base that on the fact that I'm a proud Golden Eagle graduate of the School of Nursing here. And when I studied here in the 60s, we looked at the profession of nursing and felt that it would be better served in the collegiate setting with a broader emphasis on the field of study. So I really think that will be how we will get from here to there, or a big part of it. So I thank you very much for including that in the article.
Thank you.
I think it's a great thing, and I remember 25 years ago I did talk about this issue that you raised today here. As a foreigner person who came to this country to work with the immigrants and refugees, and have friends who are priests from different countries, who are left out. I mean, I heard that you invite few people to come, but I didn't hear nobody who's a foreigner, who is a priest here in this country, in this nation. And I
Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, you are. That's true. And Tom too. Well,
St. Patrick's Day is done.
I guess I guess my point was to the minority. Minority. That's minority. Because one thing I felt since I came to this country, I felt out of the culture of being Catholic in this country, as minority, as a black person. And all these 25 years, I have so many friends, priests, who are gone because sexual abuse and other issues, racism and so forth. Even today, there are priests who are there who are unhappy, alone, lonely. And this young lady who said, how do you live by yourself? What do you do and so forth? And I told her, I'm not by myself because I have so many people around me. The only time by myself is on my bed alone. Praise the Lord. But, I would like to hear some of that, how the aspect of foreigners, I mean, the minorities, who, especially now we talk about a lot of Africans come to America, Brazilians and so forth. And I have known people have get into trouble already and run away and back. In your study, have you talked about this, the influence of culture and so forth? How? Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. You want to take it?
Yes, we did. We spent the better part of the first 4 months really listening to different guests that we had come in, reading through documents. We had a document on the reality of international priests, multicultural parishes. So I think it was really a matter of, we have so many things that we really could do within priesthood and really trying to narrow it down. So.
Yeah, and we do state very clearly at the beginning that it's one of the features of the contemporary atmosphere that's affecting priesthood. So we didn't propose solution to it, but we did recognize that this question about the internationality and the need to be sensitive to an intercultural response and so on is one issue that's going to shape the future of the church. So it's definitely there.
One last question, please.
Yes. Mine goes mainly to the third presentation. A few weeks ago, in a parish context, we were speaking about what is happening around our priests. And the conclusion we ended with was we need holy priests. With that in mind, my question is, and it goes to the third presentation, which was presented within the context of the supernatural existential. Now, with that in mind, what can one suggest to parishioners to do in their parishes for their priests?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lugira, one of our senior professors, retired, and lovely to see you. I think that the priest has to be totally located in the community. To be apart from it, to be over it, to be under it, to be ahead of it, to be behind it, won't work. I think of that stranger on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24, who joins their company and walks along with them. Now, he's the risen Christ, but he never tells them what to see. Instead, he says to them, "What are you talking about?" Tell them, in other words, enters into their life, asks them their question, "What's going on in your life? What are you talking about?" And they said, "What do you mean, what are we talking about?" "All the things that happened in Jerusalem these past few days." And he says, "What things?" Now, let's agree. Nobody knew better than he what happened in Jerusalem these past few days. And yet he wants them to tell him. So that joining their company, walking along with them, eliciting their story, hearing their shattered vision, we were hoping he was the one who would set Israel free, and then turning and sharing the word of God, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. He interprets for them every passage of Scripture that referred to himself and the Messiah to suffer so as to enter into his glory, and yet doesn't tell them, but spends the time with them, joins them at the table, and in the breaking of the bread, which is the bread of Eucharist, but it's also the bread of presence, the bread of friendship, the bread of life, the bread of companionship. That's when they come to see for themselves and then turn around and go back and rejoin the faith community in Jerusalem. That's the model, I think, of priesthood that has to be operative, that accompaniment, that drawing out of people's lives, that listening to them, indeed sharing God's word, breaking it open for their lives, but then empowering them to see for themselves and then to take agency for their faith and to return and rejoin the faith community.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor being part of the conversation as it continues. Thank you. Thank you.